You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 371, Creating Washington, D.C. Back in episode 367, we covered the Grand Compromise, where states agreed to the assumption of war debts, along with moving the capital to the banks of the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. That compromise included the Residence Act of 1790, which would locate the permanent capital on the banks of the Potomac River. It authorized the president to appoint 3 commissioners to establish exact borders for the new capital, to purchase the necessary land, and to begin building accommodations necessary for the federal government. The Constitution and the authorizing legislation both limited the size of the new federal district to 100 square miles, 10 miles by 10 miles. There was some debate about whether placing the site further upriver above Great Falls, but pretty quickly the focus became the area around Georgetown, Maryland, a small community just below Great Falls. Georgetown itself had become a thriving tobacco market and had recently begun building a new college there, although the first students had not yet been admitted. Like many communities, Georgetown had submitted several petitions to Congress, hoping to be chosen as the new federal capital. Landowners had a particular incentive, since land prices would skyrocket if the new capital moved there. Maryland also had already passed a law in 1788 willing to cede the land for the capital, and Virginia passed a similar law in 1789. In September 1790, just after the second session of Congress ended, President Washington sent Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to scout out the area and meet with local landowners about the possibility of locating the capital there. Although Washington had already made clear that he wanted the capital in the Georgetown area, the officials remained cagey, trying to assure good purchase prices for the land and making clear that local cooperation would be critical if they wanted the capital to move there. The site was not definite, and they noted that Philadelphia was still trying to do everything it possibly could to keep the capital where it was. To help sweeten the pot, Jefferson suggested that local landowners donate some of their land to the new federal capital. Washington also personally toured the area that fall. While he already had strong preferences for establishing the district in the area covering Georgetown, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia, he also indicated to the locals that he was considering other locations, thus pressuring them to be more generous with those transfers of land. When Washington was ready to announce the location, a problem arose. The limits set by Congress were about 4 miles north of where Washington wanted to place the capital. He wanted to include the city of Alexandria, Virginia. To do that, Congress had to amend its legislation to give the president that option. Now, some in Congress criticized the fact that the president was placing the capital so close to his home in Mount Vernon. What was not widely known at the time was that Washington owned over 2,000 acres of land, either on his own or in trust for his grandson, within the borders of the new capital. Some officials later grumbled that Washington stood to make a fortune from his selection, but that matter really never rose to more than grumbling in private letters and discussions. On January 24, 1791, Washington submitted his final choice of land to Congress. He appointed 3 commissioners: David Stewart of Alexandria, Virginia, Thomas Johnson of Frederick, Maryland, and Daniel Carroll of Rock Creek, Maryland. It was unusual for the president not to include geographic diversity in any multi-person commission that he'd ever set up. Madison had suggested appointing at least one commissioner from New England or the Deep South, just to have an outside voice on the commission. Washington, however, chose men who all lived in the area and had financial interests as landowners. They were all close to Washington and willing to follow his guidance on issues related to the new capital plan. All 3 men had been vocal promoters of the Potomac location before the selection. Stewart, who was elected to Congress, was one of the Virginia congressmen who switched his vote on the assumption of debt in order to get the compromise deal of moving the capital to the Potomac. David Stewart, who lived in Alexandria, had been Washington's personal doctor for many years and also handled some of Washington's financial affairs. Stewart had also married into the family. after Washington's stepson Jackie died just after Yorktown, Stuart married Jackie's wife Nellie a couple of years later. This made George Washington's step-grandchildren Stuart's stepchildren. It also meant that the two men shared a financial interest in managing the lands and estates for the Custis children. Stuart was also an investor in the Potomac Company, along with Washington. In 1790, before being nominated as a commissioner, Stuart had accompanied Madison and Jefferson on their mission to inspect the proposed site and negotiate with local landowners. Of course, Stuart was also a local landowner, and he would benefit from these negotiations. The second commissioner, Thomas Johnson of Frederick, Maryland, was also a longtime associate of Washington. He served as a state judge. Washington had offered him a federal judgeship, giving him the District of Maryland, but Johnson declined. Around that same time, the Chief Justice of the state of Maryland died. Johnson took that position instead. Johnson was also an investor in the Potomac Company. He actually took over as the company's chief executive when Washington resigned to go serve as President of the United States. The third commissioner, Daniel Carroll of Rock Creek, was also a longtime associate of Washington's and also an investor in the Potomac Company. Like Stuart, Carroll had been elected to Congress and had been one of the congressmen who switched his vote on the assumption of debt in order to get the capital moved to the Potomac. Carroll had lost his seat in Congress, probably in part because of his switched vote on assumption. Carroll owned thousands of acres in or near the proposed site for the capital. He was also related to several men who owned a great deal more land in the center of the proposed district that the government was going to have to purchase in order to locate the capital where they planned. All three men had known Washington for decades, as I said, owned large amounts of land in the area, and had been partners with Washington in other land deals. Now, despite any potential conflicts of interest, Congress expressed no opposition or concerns for Washington's appointments. All three men were highly respected, and Washington's reputation for selecting men of good character was enough for Congress. The Senate even waived the need to confirm the commissioners. To design the new city, Washington chose Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who probably deserves a little backstory. L'Enfant was born into a wealthy French family back in 1754. His father was a painter and an academic at the Académie Royale des Peintures et du Sculpture in Paris. Pierre studied there as a boy, receiving an education in architecture, landscape architecture, science, and mathematics. Now, despite having no military training, L'Enfant had a connection with Beaumarchais, who convinced the boy to go to America in 1776 and volunteer in the Continental Army. It was only as he was about to leave for America that he received a brevet commission as a lieutenant in the French Army, presumably to provide some protection as an officer in case his ship was captured at sea. L'Enfant did not arrive in America until late 1777. When he arrived in York, Pennsylvania, seeking a commission, French General de Coudray dismissed him as having some talent in drawing, but not really an engineer. Coudray drowned a few weeks later, but Congress nevertheless sent L'Enfant packing. L'Enfant was still in Boston in early 1778, awaiting passage back to France when he met up with the recently arrived Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. The two men hit it off, and Steuben asked L'Enfant to serve as his aide and got him a commission as a captain in the Continental Army. L'Enfant then went to Valley Forge, where, among other things, he got George Washington to sit for a portrait. L'Enfant, during the war, saw some combat as Steuben's aide, but he took no notable role in these early battles. He also drew several illustrations for von Steuben's manual for the Continental Army. Captain L'Enfant was also involved in a scandal in 1778. While he had been sitting around Boston awaiting his return to France, he wrote a rather bitter letter to a friend that was critical of the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. The British captured the letter and published it, or at least an English translation of it, in the London papers. L'Enfant wrote a letter to Washington at the time saying the translation had mischaracterized what he said and that he remained respectful of both Congress and the Army. It seemed the matter just dropped. Nobody really cared about it. After all, a 23-year-old who had just traveled to America to volunteer for a cause only to be rejected and on his way home was likely to harbor some bad feelings that obviously went away when he got his commission. In 1779, L'Enfant transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, where he worked with Lieutenant Colonel John Laurens on a plan to raise a regiment of slaves. That, of course, never materialized due to opposition by South Carolina leaders. In October, L'Enfant saw combat at the Siege of Savannah, and at that point he was seriously wounded. In fact, one person who saw him lying on the battlefield reported him as dead. Reports of his death were greatly exaggerated. He recuperated in Charleston, and by the following year he was well enough to participate in the defense of Charleston, only to become a prisoner of war when the British captured that town. He was paroled over a year later, but was never formally exchanged until after Yorktown, meaning that he could not return to active duty. By 1782, as the war was winding down, L'Enfant had some more time for painting and made at least 2 large works depicting the area around West Point. He also returned to design, building a pavilion in Philadelphia as part of the larger celebration of King Louis XVI's first son. The pavilion received great reviews and helped set up L'Enfant's post-war career. L'Enfant, at Washington's request, also designed the logo for the Society of the Cincinnati. In my description of L'Enfant's war record and his pre-war life, there were not many impressive architectural or engineering accomplishments. L'Enfant did serve in the Corps of Engineers, but he never really had any major projects during the war. He was mostly known for his drawing ability. General Caldré's 1777 comment that L'Enfant was a decent artist but not much of an engineer seemed to have been proven accurate. L'Enfant started his continental service as a captain and remained a captain through most of the war. It was only in 1783, when the war was just about over, that L'Enfant received a brevet promotion to major just a few months before the Continental Army finally disbanded. Still, only 29 years old at the end of the war, L'Enfant moved to New York City to begin a career as an architect. While he had little experience, he had some great contacts. He knew Washington, he knew Benjamin Franklin, and a number of top other military leaders who respected his talent. Alexander Hamilton and he were of a similar age and had become fairly close friends during the war. L'Enfant got the job renovating New York City Hall to make it the seat of the First Federal Congress. He also did some design work for St. Paul's Cathedral. As early as 1789, L'Enfant wrote to Washington asking to be considered for the position of city planner for the new federal city. At the time he wrote, this was more than a year before Congress decided to build a new federal city. L'Enfant, who had no city planning experience but had studied it in school, nevertheless got the job. Washington gave him the appointment in early 1791. The project for the new federal city also needed a surveyor. That job went to Andrew Ellicott. He was the same age as L'Enfant, born in 1754, only to a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. Shortly before the war, his family moved to Maryland. Despite the Quaker background, Ellicott took a position as a commissioned officer in the local Maryland militia. When the war broke out, he served as a captain and later was promoted to major. Ellicott was only 20 years old when the war began. He had little work experience other than the work he did with his father. Little is known about his work as a surveyor before the Revolution, but apparently he did do some of that work. He also taught mathematics in Baltimore. Near the end of the war, he began publishing his own almanac. In 1784, Ellicott worked on refining and extending the Mason-Dixon line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. His surveying work continued into 1785, when he worked on the western boundary of Pennsylvania. And over the next few years, Ellicott continued to find work as a surveyor, helping to set the northern boundary between Pennsylvania and New York, as well as the border between New York and Canada. President Washington, a former surveyor himself, recommended Ellicott to the commissioners in January, and by February Ellicott was already in Alexandria, ready to begin work. To assist in the survey, Ellicott hired Benjamin Banneker. The two men had been neighbors ever since the Ellicotts moved to Maryland in 1772. Banneker was more than a decade older than Ellicott and was also an expert mathematician. Banneker had also written his own almanac and built a working clock, mostly out of wood. He had one key thing in his background, though, that had held back his career. He was a black man. Banneker's history is a unique and interesting one. His grandmother, Molly Welsh, was an English dairymaid. One morning, a cow kicked over her bucket of milk, changing her life forever. The owner of the cow accused Molly of stealing the milk. She was convicted and sentenced to become an indentured servant in Maryland. She worked on a tobacco farm for 7 years. After completing her indenture, she amassed enough money to buy a farm herself and purchased 2 slaves recently imported from Africa. One of the slaves she purchased was named Banneker. After a few years, Molly freed her slaves and married Banneker in violation of colonial law. White women were not allowed to marry black men. The couple had 4 daughters, one of whom, Mary, fell in love with another slave who was also an immigrant from Africa named Robert. Her father, Banneker, purchased Robert and set him free, allowing the couple to marry. Since Robert had no last name, he adopted the family's surname of Banneker, which was later changed to Banneker. Their child Benjamin was born to Mary and Joseph in 1731. Being a free black man in Maryland was relatively rare at the time. Benjamin's earliest education came from his grandmother, Molly. He also attended a rare interracial school taught by a Quaker in the area. Banneker continued to work on mechanical projects, but also inherited his family's tobacco farm, which became his primary source of income. In 1787, Andrew Ellicott's father, George Ellicott, lent Banneker a telescope and several books on astronomy. The Ellicotts eventually bought part of Banneker's farm, providing him with enough money to focus on astronomy full-time. In 1791, Andrew Ellicott approached the 60-year-old Banneker to ask him to assist in surveying the new federal city. Washington kept a close eye on the federal city project as it developed. Despite having appointed like-minded men to manage this project, Washington still wanted to be involved personally. When the third session of Congress finally came to an end in March of 1791, Washington made plans to travel south and personally oversee some of the early efforts to establish the federal city. On March 28th, he was in Georgetown, meeting with local landowners. Washington was a tough negotiator. He finally convinced the landowners to donate 1/2 of their lands inside the district to the government. All of that land would be divided into lots so that the land retained by the owners would be interspersed among the public lands. This meant that the land they retained, which had once been near worthless country land, would become valuable city lots that they could sell at a substantial profit. The owners also agreed that the government would establish the roads across their land, and there would be no payments for the land used by roads. The agreement was signed on March 30th, and it gave to Washington, quote, the sole power of directing the federal city to be laid off in whatever manner he pleases. The government planned to sell some of the donated land to raise funds necessary to build the new federal buildings. It would also require that anyone purchasing a lot in the district would have to build on it within a fixed period of time. This was designed to ensure that the new capital would have enough buildings to support public officials and employees, and not simply be held by land speculators. Over the course of the spring and summer, Ellicott and Banneker surveyed the district's borders. L'Enfant drew up plans for the city's layout. Washington personally approved L'Enfant's early sketches in June, and by August, L'Enfant had completed his final detailed plans for the city's design. Washington, along with guidance from Jefferson and Madison, approved those plans. L'Enfant had started with a simple grid system, but on top of that, he overlaid a series of grand avenues that would connect various public buildings with large diagonal roads. Everything centered around what L'Enfant called the Congress House, later called the Capitol, which he placed on the highest point of land near the center of the district. L'Enfant referred to the area as Jenkins Hill, since Thomas Jenkins was leasing the land at the time, but the hill never really had a name before that. It was just a hill out in the middle of nowhere. This hill would eventually become known as Capitol Hill. About a mile to the northwest, L'Enfant established the location for the president's mansion, also chosen for its location on higher ground. Between the two, the designer proposed a grand avenue 400 feet wide which would provide a center city area that people could enjoy. This would eventually become the National Mall. L'Enfant's plan did have its opponents from the beginning. Jefferson thought it was too much like European cities. He had envisioned a smaller and simpler capital city spanning about 20 blocks from the Potomac River in the area primarily known today as Foggy Bottom. Jefferson wanted a simple grid system that represented Republican simplicity and rationality. He objected to the idea of grand avenues and circles. Commissioner Stewart also thought that L'Enfant's plan was too large in scale. The park around the presidential mansion seemed more fitting for what he called a despotic government than for a republic. Washington, however, liked the design, so L'Enfant's plan went forward. Now, the city itself that L'Enfant had designed would only take up about 1/10 of the entire district. In September, the commissioners agreed to name this city Washington and the overall district Columbia. Fights among those involved in the process began almost at the outset. The first public auction of land in Georgetown raised very little revenue, selling only 35 lots. L'Enfant, who had objected to having an early auction, refused to make his design of the city available to would-be bidders, meaning most of the people did not know how the lots would fit into the overall city plan. Despite this inauspicious beginning, however, the building of the city of Washington, D.C. had begun to take shape. And next week, President Washington takes his southern tour and gives his second State of the Union address. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Michael Mulhern, Mitchell Anderson, and welcome to Gordon Kemp, who recently upgraded his support to the Alexander Hamilton Club. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Chasen Harrison and Patrick LeBeau, and welcome new standard bearers on Patreon, Sinan Bruce and John Klotz. I also want to thank Jeffrey Seviers, Michael Kimmel, Robert Finelli, and Ed Franks for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I want to mention that we have 2 live events this month. On Wednesday, December 10th, 2025, our roundtable will be joined by author Jack Kelly to discuss his new book, Tom Paine's War. The following week, on Tuesday the 16th, Mark Edward Lender will join us to discuss the book that he co-wrote with James Kirby Martin, War Without Mercy. If you want to join live on Zoom for either or both of these roundtables, be sure that you are signed up for my mailing list so that you will get the Zoom link ahead of time, or join as a free member on Patreon, where I also post that Zoom link. Now, of course, these roundtable discussions will be recorded and released a few weeks later, but if you want to participate live, you get to ask questions of the author and me. These events are free, and anyone is invited. This week, we covered the establishment of Washington, D.C. It would take a decade before the federal government would move in, but they needed pretty much all of that time. The fight between L'Enfant and the commissioners only grew over time. L'Enfant felt like he reported directly to Washington and did not consider himself subordinate to the commissioners. The commissioners described him as contemptuous, stubborn, and insufferable. The biggest disputes, of course, were over money. The cost of L'Enfant's dream city was far more than the federal government was willing to spend. For example, L'Enfant wanted all of the city streets to be paved. The cost of doing just that would be several times more than the entire federal budget. He requested hiring 1,000 workmen and predicted spending well over $1 million during the first 4 years of construction. This workforce would be larger than the U.S. Army and would cost about 3 times the entire federal budget. L'Enfant assumed the government would be willing to incur more debt to pay for the city, but they were not. L'Enfant also ordered the demolition of Commissioner Daniel Carroll's home because it stood in the way of one of his city's grand avenues. Washington, on the advice of Jefferson, ended up backing L'Enfant on the demolition issue, but was upset that L'Enfant was not working and playing well with the commissioners. Things came to a head over the winter of 1791-92 when L'Enfant called for his workforce of only 75 men at the time to continue their work over the winter, even though the commissioners called for a suspension of work until the following spring. L'Enfant told his assistant, Isaac Roberdeau, to ignore the commissioners. When Roberdeau refused to leave, the commissioners had him arrested for trespassing in early 1792. This time, Washington backed the commissioners. He had Jefferson write a letter to L'Enfant making clear that he had to subordinate himself to the commissioners and that the commissioners had the final say on all hiring decisions. Washington then sent his secretary, Tobias Lear, to discuss some issues with L'Enfant. After L'Enfant refused to meet with Lear, Washington had had enough. He had Jefferson write to L'Enfant telling him he was fired. After L'Enfant's dismissal, the commissioners tried to alter his plans for the city. Washington insisted that they retain the plans. Washington liked the plans for the city. He just wasn't willing to put up with L'Enfant's attitude. Officials did have to scramble to find some architects who would design the Capitol and the presidential mansion. They had been expecting L'Enfant to handle that. Washington, who was on the Southern tour at the time, which is something I'm going to discuss next week, met with architect James Hoban in Charleston, South Carolina, who ultimately won the opportunity to design the White House. Hoban's design was based on the home of the Duke of Leinster in Dublin, Ireland. A contest was also held for the design of the Capitol. A wealthy Englishman won that contest. James Thornton immigrated to Philadelphia a few years after the war ended. Thornton's only architectural experience up until that time was having won another competition to design the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1789. Despite this, Thornton's proposal for the Capitol, which was based on the front of the Louvre in Paris and the dome from the Pantheon in Rome, immediately caught Washington's eye. Despite the fact that his entry came in after the deadline, he was awarded the prize. Andrew Ellicott took up L'Enfant's position as city planner, but got frustrated and quit within a year. The commissioners then moved through a succession of planners, with no one keeping the job for very long. There were at least 8 planners in the 9 years before the federal government moved to D.C. in 1800. L'Enfant moved back to New York, where he worked on plans for Paterson, New Jersey. He also designed a grand new mansion for Robert Morris in Philadelphia, something that contributed to Morris's bankruptcy before it was completed. Years later, L'Enfant would serve as a professor of engineering at West Point. President James Monroe asked him to oversee the design of Fort Washington on the Potomac. Once again, L'Enfant's refusal to control costs led him to leaving that job as well. Later in life, L'Enfant had many money problems. Congress eventually paid him a few $1,000s for his work designing Washington, D.C., but almost all of that money went to paying off 10 years of room and board that he owed to other people. L'Enfant lived his final years as the house guest of a wealthy Maryland planter named Thomas Diggs. He died there, impoverished, in 1825, in the site of Fort Washington, which he had designed, and only about 7 miles outside of Washington, D.C., the city for which he will always be remembered. My book recommendation this week is Washington, The Making of an American Capital by Fergus Bordwich. This is a great book that covers the congressional decision to create the Capitol through the federal government's move to the new Capitol in 1800. It's over 250 pages, not counting notes and index, and I think it's a pretty good read. The author, Fergus Bordwich, is an award-winning writer who also wrote a great book about the First Congress. And quite a few books that I used this week, and I've included in the bottom of my blog episode if you want to check them out, have devoted a chapter or two to the subject that we covered this week. The book I'm recommending here is the only one I found that is an entire book devoted to this subject. So if you want to read more about the efforts that went into creating Washington, D.C., get Washington, The Making of an American Capital by Fergus Bordwich. My online recommendation is an older book that covers much of the same topic. It's called A History of the National Capital by W.B. Bryan. Volume 1 covers the establishment of the Capitol from the debates in Congress in 1790 through 1814 when the British Army burned the city. This book has more details. It has over 600 pages of text, Because it was published in 1914, it's in the public domain and available for download on archive.org. As always, I've included direct links in my show notes and on my blog. My question this week asks, is there any link between the Hessians and the Pennsylvania Dutch? Well, the Pennsylvania Dutch are from German states, but the bulk of them arrived before the Revolutionary War. German-speaking communities were established in Pennsylvania in the late 1600s and early 1700s, as well as in New York, as well as the frontier region of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Most of these groups continued to speak German as their primary language until World War I, when speaking German became considered disloyal to America and associated anyone who spoke it with the enemy. Most of the German immigrants who first settled in Pennsylvania were pacifists, or at least hoping to get away from the militarism and constant wars being fought in the German states at the time. The overwhelming number of these immigrants came from German states other than Hesse. Then Hessian soldiers came to America during the Revolutionary War. A great many of them were taken prisoner and were often confined to areas of these German-speaking communities. The Hessians could share a common language with these Pennsylvanians and others, but they also represented the militarism that the settlers had been trying to escape. Over the course of their confinement as prisoners of war, many Hessian soldiers were given limited parole and permitted to work and live in these communities. A rather large number of Hessians became part of the communities in which they lived, and when it came time for them to return home, many opted to stay in America and join the communities where they had been living as prisoners. So yes, there are a few people in the Pennsylvania Dutch community today who might have ancestors who were Hessian soldiers, but these communities were already well established by the time the Hessian soldiers joined them. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.